You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So by now you've all seen the news that Trump's $455 million bond is being pared down to $175 million. So Glenn, first of all, so as not to bury the lead here, your reaction to this decision by the court?
I think the verdict is in, Brian. I think the rules, the laws, and the Constitution apply differently to Donald Trump than they apply to you and me. There is a recurring theme here. Whether it's Michael Cohen being involved in a conspiracy with Donald Trump to make hush money payments and falsify business records to cover them up. Michael Cohen is the smaller criminal fish in that conspiracy. Remember back when Michael Cohen was being prosecuted and ultimately imprisoned for those crimes, Donald Trump was designated individual number one, the other person in that criminal scheme. And Donald Trump has not suffered 1 minute of accountability for it. Now, let's turn to other matters. Donald Trump is an adjudicated insurrectionist. A trial court found he engaged in insurrection. A state Supreme Court affirmed that he engaged in insurrection. And even though the Constitution says plain language that an insurrectionist shall be disqualified, the Supreme Court said, but not for Donald Trump. We are not going to let states disqualify him. Then you can turn to the absolute immunity argument. There's not a single word in the Constitution that supports a president is immune from criminal prosecution for the crimes he commits while in office. But the Supreme Court brought Donald Trump's D.C. federal trial for trying to overturn the 2020 election to a grinding halt because they want to delay that and they want to take up something that does not exist in the Constitution. But, they're textualists, right? So I think the only takeaway is that when the appellate court in New York just did this enormous favor for Donald Trump without analysis, right? I am holding the entire page-and-a-half ruling. There's not one word of analysis from the appellate court in New York, and they simply said, we understand you're on the hook for nearly $500 million. We're going to reduce it. You only have to put up $175 million or a bond securing that amount if you want to appeal your conviction without Tish James being able to begin seizing your assets. Brian, I'm sorry. This reinforces what I think we have all sensed for a very long time, that the rules, the laws, and the Constitution apply differently to Donald Trump.
To that point, would this special treatment be granted to anybody else, to any other entity, to any other person?
No, not that I can see. The thing that so bothers me about this is not only the unequal application of law, but Donald Trump just days ago posted, I've got $500 million in cash. What could possibly be the rationale of the appeals court? Of course, we don't know because they chose not to share their rationale with us, to say, you know what? We don't want to bleed you dry, Donald, right? We don't want to put you, in extreme financial circumstances. So just let us reduce it to $175 million. I mean, if that doesn't scream injustice and unequal application of the law, I don't know what does.
There were other entities that had to post even larger bonds: Carnegie Mellon, Sony, Oracle, Apple. So why did they have to find the money, despite how extraordinary that amount is, and yet Donald Trump doesn't?
Well, they weren't a former president of the United States. Those organizations were not a candidate to be president of the United States in the future. And for whatever reason, the appeals court in New York decided to treat Donald Trump differently, significantly so, even when there is no known reason to. The one thing that I hesitate to bring up, because it's certainly not good news, but I think we need to put it on the table, I believe this is an indication that the appeals court might have looked at Judge Engoron's judgment, the amount he came up with that Donald Trump has to disgorge or pay back, nearly $500 million. They may have a serious disagreement or concern about how he reached that amount. I think that's one of the signals that they're sending by reducing it to $175 million, because the reason it's so dangerous to reduce the bond amount is because, let's assume Donald Trump posts that bond. Let's assume that Donald Trump's case is affirmed on appeal. In other words, the appeals court says, oh, you owe the whole $500 million plus. Remember, Donald Trump is accruing interest to the tune of $111,000 a day on that money judgment. But if he has only been made to put up a bond in the amount of $175 million, that is ultimately all that we know, all the assets we know will be available to be paid out to the people of New York in the event his case is appealed. So this could end up working to the extreme detriment of the people of New York and Tish James and the whole team that has worked so hard to hold Donald Trump accountable for his wrongdoing. So, this is really an ominous ruling by the appeals court.
Well, to that point, if he does appeal, only puts up $175 million, and the appeals court affirms the lower court's ruling that he owes $500 million, can Tish James then carry out the process that she seems to be carrying out right now, which is to start putting liens on his property, start the process of seizing his properties to satisfy that full $500 million judgment?
Yeah, she can, but remember, the bond that's put up, the insurer will only be in a position to have to pay out $175 million. And the rest of it, sure, Tish James can go after Donald Trump's properties if he hasn't transferred them, reduced them in value, sold them off. Now, the only good news, and there's not much of a silver lining behind this story, the only good news is even though the appeals court stayed or stopped or paused pretty much everything Judge Engoron did, like Donald Trump and his sons, serving on boards or doing business with New York banks, they paused all of that. The only thing they didn't pause was the monitor that Judge Engoron put in place over Trump and his assets to make sure he's not involved in nefariously, either dissipating the value of them or transferring them or otherwise making them unavailable to Tish James at the end of the day in the event the appeal is affirmed and she begins having to seize his properties to satisfy the money judgment.
Well, this is all moot to your earlier point. If Trump ultimately loses his appeal, he would still have to pay the full $455 million. In your opinion, what do you think his chances of winning this appeal are?
I've been involved in a lot of cases that were appealed, but they were pretty much exclusively criminal cases. And once the case is proved beyond a reasonable doubt, a relatively low number of appeals are successful. In other words, a relatively low number of cases are busted on appeal and sent back down to the trial court for a new trial. This kind of civil litigation was pretty complex. I don't think it was so extraordinary that courts haven't dealt with these sort of intensely financial aspects of criminal litigation the way this trial was. You had battles of the experts on competing valuations of property. But my sense is, from trying to absorb as much of the evidence as I could as the reporting was coming out during the course of the trial, it seems to be on very strong and firm footing, the judgment that Judge Engoron made. The other thing is, when a jury verdict is attached, sometimes the appeals court can say, well, the jurors aren't really experts at judging, even though we entrust them to be the judges of fact. But Judge Engoron had the benefit of having lots of expert witnesses testify, both for the state, for AG Tish James and her prosecutors, and for Donald Trump. And he reached a conclusion that I think is going to be well supported in the evidence that was introduced during the course of the trial. So I guess if I were placing my $1 bet, I would bet on the case being affirmed, but I don't think you can conclude it's an absolute sure thing.
And let's finish off with this. What do you think that this decision by the appeals court to basically more than halve his bond amount, what do you think that this says about the court system more broadly right now?
It says that the law doesn't seem to be applied equally when it comes to what I call the ruling class criminals, right? The influential, the powerful, the wealthy, the connected, that often translates into the white male. For whatever reason, the courts often seem to flinch. You're a young person of color who steals a purse or sells a rock of crack. We're going to come at you with both guns blazing, figuratively speaking, the criminal justice system. You might find yourself in pretrial detention. So the takeaway as has now been reinforced through a number of the legal decisions that we have seen involving Donald Trump. The takeaway is really that our institutions of government seem either unwilling or unable to hold Donald Trump accountable the way they would hold, any regular Joe accountable.
Yeah, and I would just add for folks, just to end this on a note of some optimism here, is that you've all heard Glenn and I say this point before, but it was never up to the courts to save us. It was always our responsibility to save ourselves, to show up in November and make sure that we cast ballots in Joe Biden's favor or against Donald Trump in numbers that are, as Glenn says, too big to rig and too real to steal. So that remains the case now. I would just say, I know that there is maybe a feeling of hopelessness, of despair, that Donald Trump will always kind of get away with it, that he's Teflon Don. Do not reward this guy by giving him exactly what he wants and checking out, because that's exactly what he's looking for. He's looking to make you feel like your voice doesn't matter, your vote doesn't matter, your participation doesn't matter, and it obviously does. And so don't give this guy exactly what he's looking for by throwing your hands up and checking out, because we have the numbers to defeat him. We've done it once in 2020, and we can do it again now. He is in a weaker position, despite what he may claim. He's in a weaker position now than he ever has been.
Yeah, Brian, I always say, let your frustration and your despair fuel you. Let it motivate you. Don't give him what he wants. He wants us to throw up our hands and say, oh, I guess there's just no justice. Let the injustice that keeps working to Donald Trump's advantage fuel you, motivate you, energize you to double down on voting and getting out the vote and helping others get to the polls in November. Because as Brian says, it really is up to us, and we're up to the challenge.
Perfectly put. We'll leave it there. For those watching right now, if you want to follow along with this process as Trump's prosecutions continue to play themselves out, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.